Okay, this is the house where, at Steventon, where Jane Austen was born, the author of Pride and Prejudice. This is in the Harvard Classics shelf of fiction. It also has a sentimental journey through France and Italy in the same volume as Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Copyright 1917. Okay, so this here is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We'll look at the biographical note and the criticisms and interpretations. And we'll leave out the chapters reading it, as you can get that in other places. It goes through chapter 61, it looks like. Biographical note. The impression of the condition of the Church of England in the 18th century, which is conveyed by the character and writings of Lawrence Sterne, receives some necessary modification from a study of the life and works of Jane Austen. Her father, the Reverend George Austen, held the two rectories of Dean and Steventon in Hampshire, having been appointed to them by the favor of a cousin and an uncle. He thus belonged to the gentry, and it seems likely that he entered the church more as a profession than a vocation. He considered that he fulfilled his functions by preaching once a week and administering the sacraments. And though he does not seem to have been a man of spiritual gifts, the decent and dignified performance of these formal duties earned him the reputation of a model pastor. His abundant leisure he occupied in farming the rectory acres, educating his children, and sharing the social life of his class. The environment of refined worldliness and good breeding thus indicated was that in which his daughter lived and which she pictured in her books. Jane Austen was born at Steventon on December 16, 1775. The youngest of 7 children, she received her education, scanty enough by modern standards, at home. Besides the usual elementary subjects, she learned French and some Italian, sang a little, and became an expert needlewoman. Her reading extended little beyond the literature of the 18th century, and within that period she seemed to have cared most for the novels of Richardson and Miss Burney, and the poems of Cowper and Crabbe. Dr. Johnson, too, she admired, and later was delighted with both the poetry and prose of Scott. The first 25 years of her life she spent at Steventon. In 1801, she moved with her family to Bath, then a great center of fashion. After the death of her father in 1805, she lived with her mother and sister, first at Southampton and then at Chawton. Finally, she took lodgings at Winchester to be near a doctor, and there she died on July 18th, 1817, and was buried in the cathedral. Apart from a few visits to friends in London and elsewhere, and the vague report of a love affair with a gentleman who died suddenly, there is little else to chronicle in this quiet and uneventful life. But quiet and uneventful though her life was, it yet supplied her with material for half a dozen novels, as perfect of their kind as any in the language. While still a young girl, she had experimented with various styles of writing, and when she completed Pride and Prejudice at the age of 22, it was clear that she had found her appropriate form. This novel, which in many respects she never surpassed, was followed a year later by Northanger Abbey, a satire on the Gothic romances then in vogue. And in 1809 she finished Sense and Sensibility, begun a dozen years before. So far, she had not succeeded in having any of her works printed. But in 1811, Sense and Sensibility appeared in London and won enough recognition to make easy the publication of the others. Success gave stimulus, and between 1811 and 1816, she completed Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. The last of these and Northanger Abbey were published posthumously. The most remarkable characteristic of Jane Austen as a novelist is her recognition of the limits of her knowledge of life and her determination never to go beyond these limits in her books. She describes her own class in the part of the country with which she was acquainted, and both the types of character and the events are such as she knew from first-hand observation and experience. But to the portrayal of these she brought an extraordinary power of delicate and subtle delineation, a gift of lively dialogue, and a peculiar detachment. She abounds in humor, but it is always quiet and controlled. And though one feels that she sees through the affectations and petty hypocrisies of her circle, she seldom becomes openly satirical. The fineness of her workmanship, unexcelled in the English novel, makes possible the discrimination of characters who have outwardly little or nothing to distinguish them, and the analysis of the states of mind and feeling of ordinary people is done so faithfully and vividly as to compensate for the lack of passion and adventure. She herself speaks of the little bit, 2 inches wide, of ivory on which I work. And in contrast with the broad canvases of Fielding or Scott, her stories have the exquisiteness of a fine miniature. That was by W.A.N. And now from her biography to criticisms and interpretations. The first one is by Sir Walter Scott himself. Read again, and for the third time at least, Miss Austen's very finely written novel of Pride and Prejudice. That young lady has a talent for describing the involvements and feelings and characters of ordinary life, which is to me the most wonderful I ever met with. The big bow-wow strain I can do myself like any now going, but the exquisite touch, which renders ordinary commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth of the description and the sentiment, is denied to me. That's from the Journal of Sir Walter Scott, March 1826. We bestow no mean compliment upon the author of Emma when we say that, keeping close to common incidents and to such characters as occupy the ordinary walks of life, she has produced sketches of such spirit and originality that we never miss the excitation which depends upon a narrative of uncommon events, arising from the consideration of minds, manners, and sentiments greatly above our own. In this class she stands almost alone, For the scenes of Miss Edgeworth are laid in higher life, varied by more romantic incident, and by her remarkable power of embodying and illustrating national character. But the author of Emma confines herself chiefly to the middling classes of society. Her most distinguished characters do not rise greatly above well-bred country gentlemen and ladies, and those which are sketched with most originality and precision belong to a class rather below that standard. The narrative of all her novels is composed of such common occurrences as may have fallen under the observation of most folks, and her dramatis personae conduct themselves upon the motives and principles which the readers may recognize as ruling their own, and that of most of their own acquaintances. That's from the Quarterly Review, October 1815. The next one is by Lord Macaulay. Shakespeare has had neither equal nor second, but among the writers who, in the point which we have noticed, have approached nearest to the manner of the great master, we have no hesitation in placing Jane Austen, a woman of whom England is justly proud. She has given us a multitude of characters, all, in a certain sense, commonplace, all such as we meet every day, yet they are all as perfectly discriminated from each other as if they were the most eccentric of human beings. There are, for example, 4 clergymen, none of whom we should be surprised to find in any parsonage in the kingdom. Mr. Edward Ferrars, Mr. Henry Tilney, Mr. Edmund Bertram, and Mr. Elton. They are all specimens of the upper part of the middle class. They have all been liberally educated. They all lie under the restraints of the same sacred profession. They are all young. They are all in love. None of them has any hobby horse, to use the phrase of Sterne. Not one has a ruling passion, such as we read of in Pope. Who would not have expected them to be inspired likenesses of each other? No such thing. Harpagon is not more unlike to Jourdain. Joseph Surface is not more unlike to Sir Lucius O'Trigger than every one of Miss Austen's young divines to all his reverend brethren, and almost all this is done by touches so delicate that they elude analysis, that they defy the powers of description, and that we know them to exist only by the general effect to which they have contributed. From Essay on Madame d'Arblay, 1843. Number 3 is by W.F. Pollock. Miss Austen never attempts to describe a scene or a class of society with which she was not herself thoroughly acquainted. The conversations of ladies with ladies, or of ladies and gentlemen together, are given, but no instance occurs of a scene in which men only are present. The uniform quality of her work is one most remarkable point to be observed in it. Let a volume be opened at any place. There is the same good English, the same refined style, the same simplicity and truth. There is never any deviation into the unnatural or exaggerated. And how worthy of all love and respect is the finely disciplined genius which rejects the forcible but transient modes of stimulating interest which can so easily be employed when desired, and which knows how to trust the never-failing principles of human nature. This very trust has sometimes been made an objection to Miss Austen, and she has been accused of writing dull stories about ordinary people. But her supposed ordinary people are really not such very ordinary people. Let anyone who is inclined to criticize on this score endeavor to construct one character from among the ordinary people of his own acquaintance that shall be capable of interesting any reader for 10 minutes. It will then be found how great has been the discrimination of Miss Austen in the selection of her characters, and how skillful is her treatment in the management of them. It is true that the events are for the most part those of daily life, and the feelings are those connected with the unusual joys and griefs of familiar existence. But these are the very events and feelings upon which the happiness or misery of most of us depends, and the field which embraces them, to the exclusion of the wonderful, the sentimental, and the historical, is surely large enough, as it certainly admits of the most profitable cultivation. In the end, too, the novel of daily real life is that of which we are least apt to weary. A round of fancy balls would tire the most vigorous admirers of variety in costume, and the return to plain clothes would be hailed with greater delight than their occasional relinquishment ever gives. Miss Austen's personages are always in plain clothes, but no two suits are alike. All are worn with their appropriate differences, and under all human thoughts and feelings are at work. That's from Fraser's Magazine, January 1816. The fourth one is by Anne Thackeray Ritchie. Notwithstanding a certain reticence and self-control which seems to belong to their age, and with all their quaint dresses and ceremonies and manners, the ladies and gentlemen in Pride and Prejudice and its companion novels seem like living people out of our own acquaintance transported bodily into a bygone age, represented in the half-dozen books that contain Jane Austen's works. Dear books, bright, sparkling with wit and animation, in which the homely heroines charm, the dull hours fly, and the very bores are enchanting. She has a gift of telling a story in a way that has never been surpassed. She rules her places, times, characters, and marshals them with unerring precision. Her machinery is simple but complete. Events group themselves so vividly and naturally in her mind that, in describing imaginary scenes, we seem not only to read them, but to live them, to see the people coming and going, the gentlemen courteous and in top boots, the ladies demure and piquant. We can almost hear them talking to one another. No retrospects, no abrupt flights, as in real life. Days and events follow one another. Last Tuesday does not suddenly start into existence all at a place, nor does 1790 appear upon the scene when we are well on in 21. Countries and continents do not fly from hero to hero, nor do long and divergent adventures happen to unimportant members of the company. With Miss Austen, days, hours, minutes succeed each other like clockwork. One central figure is always present on the scene. That figure is always prepared for company. Some books and people are delightful. We can scarce tell why. They are not so clever as others that weary and fatigue us. It is a certain effort to read a story, however touching, that is disconnected and badly related. It is like an ill-drawn picture of which the coloring is good. Jane Austen possessed both gifts of color and drawing. She could see human nature as it was, with nearsighted eyes, it is true, but having seen, she could combine her picture by her art and color it from life. It is difficult, reading the novels of succeeding generations, to determine how much each book reflects of the time in which it was written, how much of its character depends upon the mind and mood of the writer. The greatest minds, the most original, have the least stamp of the age, the most of that dominant natural reality which belongs to all great minds. We know how a landscape changes as the day goes on, and how the scene brightens and gains in beauty as the shadows begin to lengthen. The clearest eyes must see by the light of their own hour. Jane Austen's hour must have been a midday hour, bright, unsuggestive, with objects standing clear without relief or shadow. She did not write of herself, but of the manners of her age. This age is essentially an age of men and women of strained emotion. Little remains of starch or powder or courtly reserve. What we have lost in calm, in happiness, in tranquility, we have gained in intensity. Our danger is now, not of expressing and feeling too little, but of expressing more than we feel. Miss Austen's heroines have a stamp of their own. They have a certain gentle self-respect and humor and hardness of heart in which modern heroines are a little wanting. Whatever happens, they can, for the most part, speak of gaily and without bitterness. Love with them does not mean a passion so much as an interest, deep, silent, not quite incompatible with a secondary flirtation. Marianne Dashwood's tears are evidently meant to be dried. Jane Bennett smiles, sighs, and makes excuses for Bingley's neglect. Emma passes one disagreeable morning making up her mind to the unnatural alliance between Mr. Knightley and Harriet Smith. It was the spirit of the age, and perhaps one not to be unenvied. It was not that Jane Austen herself was incapable of understanding a deeper feeling. In the last written page of her last written book, there is an expression of the deepest and truest experience. Anne Elliot's talk with Captain Harville is the touching utterance of a good woman's feelings. They are speaking of men and women's affections. "You are always laboring and toiling," she says, "exposed to every risk and hardship. Your home, country, friends, all united, neither time nor life to call your own. It would be hard indeed," with a faltering voice, "if a woman's feelings were to be added to all this." Farther on, she says eagerly, "I hope I do justice to all that is felt by you, and by those who resemble you. God forbid that I should undervalue the warm and faithful feelings of any of my fellow creatures. I should deserve utter contempt if I dared to suppose that true attachment and constancy were known only by woman. No, I believe you capable of everything great and good in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion, and to every domestic forbearance, so long as, if I may be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives, and lives for you. All the privilege I claim for my own. It is not a very enviable one, you need not court it, is that of loving longest when existence or when hope is gone. She could not immediately have uttered another sentence. Her heart was too full, her breath too much oppressed. Dear Anne Elliot, sweet, impulsive, womanly, tender-hearted. One can almost hear her voice pleading the cause of all true women. In those days, when perhaps people's nerves were stronger than they are now, sentiment may have existed in a less degree, or have been more ruled by judgment. It may have been calmer and more matter of fact. And yet Jane Austen, at the very end of her life, wrote thus. Her words seem to ring in our ears after they have been spoken. Anne Elliot must have been Jane Austen herself, speaking for the last time. There is something so true, so womanly about her, that it is impossible not to love her. She is the bright-eyed heroine of the earlier novels matured, chastened, cultivated, to whom fidelity has brought only great depth and sweetness instead of bitterness and pain. That was from the Cornhill magazine, published August 1871. The fifth is by Goldwin Smith. As we should expect from such a life, Jane Austen's view of the world is genial, kindly, and we repeat, free from anything like cynicism. It is that of a clear-sighted and somewhat satirical onlooker, loving what deserves love, and amusing herself with the foibles, the self-deceptions, the affectations of humanity. Refined almost to fastidiousness, she is hard upon vulgarity, not, however, on good-natured vulgarity, such as that of Miss Jennings in Sense and Sensibility, but on vulgarity like that of Miss Steele. In the same novel, combined at once with effrontery and with meanness of soul. To sentimentality, Jane Austen was a foe. Antipathy to it runs through her works. She had encountered it in the romances of the day, such as the works of Miss Radcliffe, and in people who had fed on them. What she would have said if she had encountered it in the form of Rousseauism, we can only guess. The solid foundation of her own character was good sense, and her type of excellence, as displayed in her heroines, is a woman full of feeling, but with her feelings thoroughly under control. Genuine sensibility, however, even when too little under control, she can regard as lovable. Marianne, in Sense and Sensibility, is an object of sympathy, because her emotions, though they are ungoverned and lead her into folly, are genuine, and are matched in intensity by her sisterly affection. But affected sentiment gets no quarter. Jane Austen had, as she was sure to have, a feeling for the beauties of nature. She paints in glowing language the scenery of Lyme. She speaks almost with rapture of a view which she calls thoroughly English. Though never having been out of England, she could hardly judge of its scenery by contrast. She was deeply impressed by the sea, on which she says, "All must linger and gaze on their first return to it. Whoever deserves to look on it at all. But admiration of the picturesque had become a mere jargon, from which Jane Austen recoiled. One of her characters is made to say that he likes a fine prospect, but not on picturesque principles, that he prefers tall and flourishing trees to those which are crooked and blasted, neat to ruined cottages, snug farmhouses to watchtowers, and a troop of tidy, happy villagers to the finest banditti in the world. Jane Austen held the mirror up to her time, or at least to a certain class of the people of her time, and her time was 2 generations and more before ours. We are reminded of this as we read her works by a number of little touches of manners and customs belonging to the early part of the century, and anterior to the rush of discovery and development which the century has brought with it. There are no railroads and no lucifer matches. It takes you 2 days and a half, even when you are flying on the wings of love or remorse, to get from Somersetshire to London. A young lady who has snuffed her candle out has to go to bed in the dark. The watchman calls the hours of the night. Magnates go about in chariots and 4 without riders, their coachmen wearing wigs. People dine at 5, and instead of spending the evening in brilliant conversation as we do, they spend it in an unintellectual rubber of whist or a round game. Life is unelectric, untelegraphic. It is spent more quietly, and it is spent at home. If you are capable of enjoying tranquility, at least by way of occasional contrast to the stir and stress of the present age, you will find in these tales the tranquility of a rural neighborhood and a little country town in England a century ago. That Jane Austen held up the mirror to her time must be remembered when she is charged with want of delicacy in dealing with the relations between the sexes, and especially in speaking of the views of women with regard to matrimony. Women in those days evidently did consider a happy marriage as the best thing that destiny could have in store for them. They desired it for themselves, and they sought it for their daughters. Other views had not opened out to them. They had not thought of professions or public life, nor had it entered into the mind of any of them that maternity was not the highest duty and the crown of womanhood. Apparently, they also confessed their aims to themselves and to each other with a frankness which would be deemed indelicate in our time. The more worldly and ambitious of them sought in marriage rank and money, and avowed that they did, whereas they would not avow it at the present day. Gossip and speculation on these subjects were common and more unrefined than they are now, and they naturally formed a large part of the amusement of the opulent and idle class from which Jane Austen's characters were drawn. Often, too, she is ironical. The love of irony is a feature of her mind, and for this also allowance must be made. She does not approve of reward matchmaking or husband hunting. Miss Jennings, the great matchmaker in Sense and Sensibility, is also a paragon of vulgarity. Miss Norris's matchmaking in Mansfield Park leads to the most calamitous results. Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice, who unblushingly avows that her object is a husband with a good income, gets what she sought, but you are made to see that she has bought it dear. The life which Jane Austen painted retains its leading features and is recognized by the reader at the present day with little effort of the imagination. It is a life of opulent quiet and rather dull employment, physically and morally healthy compared with that of a French aristocracy, though without much of the salt of duty, a life of uneventful, exempt from arduous struggles and devoid of heroism, a life presenting no materials for tragedy and hardly an element of pathos, a life of which matrimony is the chief incident and the most interesting objects are the hereditary estate and the heir. Such a life could evidently furnish no material for romance. It could furnish materials only for that class of novel which corresponds to sentimental comedy. To that class all Jane Austen's novels belong. From Life of Jane Austen in Great Writers, 1890. 6. By F.W. Cornish. Jane Austen needs no testimonials. Her position is at this moment established on a firmer basis than that of any of her contemporaries. She has completely distanced Miss Edgeworth, Miss Ferrier, Fanny Burney, and Hannah More, writers who eclipsed her modest reputation in her own day. The readers of Evelina, Ormond, Marriage, or Caleb's are few, but hundreds know intimately every character and every scene in Pride and Prejudice. She has survived Trollope and Miss Gaskell. One may almost say that she is less out of date than Currer Bell and George Eliot. It was not always so. In 1859, a writer in Blackwood's magazine spoke of her as being still unfamiliar in men's mouths, and not even now a household word. The reason for this comparative obscurity in her own time, compared with her fame at the present day, may in some measure be that in writing, as in other arts, finish is now more highly prized than formerly. But conception as well as finish is in it. The miracle of Jane Austen's writing is not only that her presentment of each character is complete and consistent, but also that every fact and particular situation is viewed in comprehensive proportion and relation to the rest. Some facts and expressions which pass almost unnoticed by the reader, and quite unnoticed by the other actors in the story, turn up later to take their proper place. She never drops a stitch. The reason is not so much that she took infinite trouble, though no doubt she did, as that everything was actual to her, as in his larger historical manner everything was actual to Macaulay. It is easier to feel than to estimate a genius which has no parallel. Jane Austen's faults are obvious. She has no remarkable distinction of style. Her plots, though worked out with microscopic delicacy, are neither original nor striking. Incident is almost absent. She repeats situations, and to some extent even characters. She cared for story and situation only as they threw light on character. She has little idealism, little romance, tenderness, poetry, or religion. All this may be conceded, and yet she stands by the side of Molière, unsurpassed among writers of prose and poetry, within the limits which she imposed on herself for clear and sympathetic vision of human character. She sees everything in clear outline and perspective. She does not care to analyze by logic what she knows by intuition. She does not search out the grounds of motive like George Eliot, nor illumine them like Meredith by searching light flashes of insight, nor like Hardy display them by irony, sardonic or pitying, nor like Henry James thread a labyrinth of indications and intimations, repulsions and attractions right and left, all pointing to the central temple, where sits the problem. She has no need to construct her characters, for there they are before her, like Mozart's music, only waiting to be written down. From Jane Austen in English Men of Letters. List of characters. Mr. Bennett, a gentleman in moderate circumstances living in a small town in Hertfordshire. Miss Bennett, his wife. Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, Lydia, daughters of Mr. and Miss Bennett. Sir William Lucas, an affable knight, formerly in trade. Lady Lucas, his wife. Charlotte, Maria, and Master Lucas are children of Sir William and Lady Lucas. Mr. Charles Bingley, a rich and amiable young man of leisure. Mr. Hurst, brother-in-law of Mr. Bingley. Miss Hurst and Miss Caroline Bingley. Those are sisters of Mr. Bingley. Fitzwilliam Darcy, a friend of Mr. Bingley and a young man of wealth and high station. Georgiana Darcy, the younger sister of Mr. Darcy. Colonel Forster, of the Shire Regiment. Miss Forster, his wife. Mr. Phillips, successor to Miss Bennet's father in business. Miss Phillips, his wife, sister to Miss Bennett. Mr. Gardner, in business in London, a brother of Miss Bennett. Miss Gardner, his wife. Several young children of the Gardners. Reverend William Collins, a pompous and obsequious clergyman, cousin to the Bennets. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a domineering, rich old lady, aunt of Mr. Darcy. Miss de Bourgh, invalid daughter of Lady Catherine. Mr. Wickham, a worthless young officer in the Shire Regiment. Miss King, courted by Wickham. Miss Jenkinson. Colonel Fitzwilliam, a cousin of Mr. Darcy and nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Miss Reynolds, Darcy's housekeeper. And that concludes the introduction to Pride and Prejudice. Thank you.